Hello all. I wanted to reference a study that is often used in paleo circles to justify their position, and it's a study that, when you look into it a little bit, shows that there's not a lot of integrity in the study itself. So it's interesting that this is used as such a strong reason for eating a paleo kind of diet. Now, this study is much better presented by Plant Positive. If you're not familiar with him, he has excellent videos on his YouTube site and his website, Plant Positive. And then also on McDougall's site, there's a guy who has addressed this in better detail than I'm going to. But I wanted to do just a brief summary, a kind of breakdown of some of the flaws in the study. So a meta-analysis, a meta-study is essentially, in statistics, they're assembling a variety of studies together, and then they're using the results of all of these studies to generate data. So the idea being, the more studies we have included in this meta-study means we have a broader statistical representation. Okay, so this study, the Siri-Tarino study, the conclusion was that there was not substantial evidence indicating that saturated fat is related to heart disease. This is kind of odd in itself because there's a tremendous amount of evidence from studies over the course of, I think, like 40 years that indicate that saturated fat is related to heart disease. So that is odd in itself. But when you look at this particular meta-study, there's about six studies which suggest that there's not a relationship between saturated fat and heart disease. And when you look at each of these studies individually, you find flaws in the studies. So I'm going to read to you some of the flaws that come out of this. Let's see. Plant Positive focused on the studies that favored paleo and high-fat apologists. It's kind of infuriating because once you see flaws in these studies, you come to the conclusion that the authors of this study were either ignorant or simply intentionally creating statistics to make an untruth appear as truth. And this latter point seems more likely once you're made aware of the fact that the authors of this meta-study were funded by, take a wild guess, the Dairy Council, National Cattlemen's Association, Beef Association, Atkins Association, and lastly, the NIH. Now, why the NIH was funding this, I have no idea. That's kind of disappointing. But anyway, here are some of the details of the study that form the basis of paleo claims that saturated fat is not related to coronary heart disease. First of all, in several of these studies, there are statements within the studies themselves that explicitly say coronary heart disease is related to high intake of fat and cholesterol. And yet, conclusions at the end of the study misdirect people away from this stated truth. And this is frequently because they do adjustments in the study that render these findings null. So basically they finagle the data, and then the results are skewed. In this meta-study, there are 16 studies included for collecting data regarding coronary heart disease. Okay, the first one we're going to address is this McGee study. In the McGee study, the initial statement can be summarized as saying essentially more meat and more cholesterol in the diet results in more coronary heart disease and more stroke. Later on, they adjust for cholesterol and it nulls the results. In the Posner or Framingham study, results show that a 10% saturated fat, a 10% content of saturated fat intake in the overall diet meant very low risk when compared with a 15% saturated fat intake. Now we have to realize here that the entire population of participants in this study doesn't have great health. In other words, most everybody in this study has horrible health anyway. And so that's why you're finding, even within this horrible health population, you're still finding data which suggests less saturated fat is better. Let's see, in the Goldborough study, if you look at actual trends without adjustment, you see clear correlation between high cholesterol and coronary heart disease. But when they over-adjust, you lose the correlation, skewing the results of the study. In the Pathogenic study, the statement is made that serum cholesterol is associated with risk of coronary events and coronary death. The way they messed up these numbers is that they had a significant group of participants who were eating a lot of trans fats. Folks who eat trans fats don't eat as many saturated fats. So this threw off the saturated fat numbers, which allowed for the erroneous conclusion that there was no evidence of relationship between saturated fat consumption and coronary heart disease. In other words, they set the trans fat folks off to the side in a sense. And because people who were eating high trans fats were eating relatively low saturated fat because they were eating trans fats instead of saturated fat. And if they get pulled out of the study, it throws off the saturated fat numbers. But really, we know that both saturated fat and trans fat are very unhealthy. Here again, all participants in the study were eating horribly, which raises the question, how much valuable data can be generated when you have no comparison to make within a generally diseased population of participants? This brings back one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Shelton. He had this phrase he used, pathogenic norm, and it means if the whole population that you're viewing objectively is sick, what conclusions can be reached? When high percentages of the American populace is eating a sad diet, your standard for normal is totally off. What percentage of the population do you think is low-fat vegan? I mean, it's very small. So, and this is another issue. How much data do we actually have? Dr. McDougall has talked about how hard it is to get funding for studies. And the fact that we see here, a lot of these studies are funded by Dairy Council, Cattlemen's Association. It's crazy. It's crazy. You don't get funding for studies that will actually reveal the truth. You get funding for studies that are questionable at best. Let's see. In this O study, so OOH, the name of the guy, O study, they adjusted for cholesterol, even adjusted for saturated fat. Now this is really weird. In a study that proposes to explore data that will reveal patterns regarding saturated fat, if you adjust for saturated fat itself, you render the study pointless. Again, when the data is viewed without the inexplicable adjustments, you see a direct relationship between increase in saturated fat consumption and coronary heart disease. So with the adjustments, this truth is hidden and erroneous conclusions are reached. In Leos-Dotier, it is likely that adjustments made for smoking had a nullifying effect on data that would otherwise have shown the harmfulness of eating saturated fat. So here, in all likelihood, people that are smoking large quantities are also ingesting large quantities of saturated fat. So if in a study you kind of set aside these smokers, you're in a sense also setting aside a bunch of folks that eat high saturated fat. So then it's throwing off your numbers. And there were also 2 Japanese studies which seem to indicate saturated fat had not a significant effect in terms of heart disease. But some confounding factors in these Japanese studies. In one of the studies, all the participants lived within range of radiation from, I think it was the atomic blasts. So, and it's been found that radiation is related to coronary heart disease. So this throws off your results in terms of saturated fat. And the case in the other Japanese study was high arsenic levels in the soil. And again, if you have a lot of arsenic, that can be a factor in terms of coronary heart disease. So you can't really make any generalized extrapolation from these Japanese studies in terms of the broader global culture in terms of saturated fat. In other words, every study within this meta-study that suggested saturated fat was not related to coronary heart disease had flaws that rendered that conclusion false. Now, there were also studies within this meta-study that showed saturated fat is related to coronary heart disease. And those we already accept, we agree with. So when you pull out all these studies that purportedly presented the other side, you find that they all crumble. And therefore, this whole meta-study crumbles. The conclusions of this whole meta-study crumbles. And this is one of the major reference points for a lot of these paleo apologists. It's just ridiculous, man. You go, and then you have to wonder, some of these folks, promoting paleo, these are like doctors, educated people. I'm just a layman. I can read this and see that it's nonsense. So thank you so much to Plant Positive for highlighting this. He does it in much greater detail. Highly recommend you go to his site if you haven't already. And also go to Dr. McDougall's site. They've got a recent article on this. But it just goes to show you, just look a little bit under the hood, look into these studies a little bit and see what's actually going on. Saturated fat is related to heart disease. Saturated fat is related to heart disease. We know that. We don't really need to be having this discussion anymore. We can move on to more important things. So, no, paleo folks, saturated fat is related to coronary heart disease. Stop eating it. Take care, y'all. Thanks for listening.